Okay. Hello, everyone. Now we're going to talk about monetary policy and the role of expectations. So we're going to talk about why expectations matter so much. And in the days of old, economists would evaluate different policy alternatives using basic regression models. And there's a number of different ways they can do this. And one particular example would be from using fiscal policy. Suppose, for example, that Congress and the President were thinking of changing tax rates, and they might want to know how consumption might react to a change in tax rates. And so what they would do is they would gather data on consumption, gather data on tax rates, and various other things that might affect consumption, such as wealth and interest rates, liquidity constraints, and other factors that you learn in your macroeconomics classes. And they would build a statistical model. And so we'd end up maybe with something along these lines. Now, again, I'm certainly simplifying here, and so we'd have consumption as a function of, for example, income, capital Y, the tax rate, and various other things, such as interest rates, wealth, liquidity constraints, and a whole variety of other factors. And so you gather all this data, and you estimate the statistical model. And, suppose that you want to see, well, what happens if we increase the tax rate? Well, you plug in the new higher tax rate into your regression model, multiply it by your regression coefficient, little d, and then you figure out the change in aggregate consumption. So it seems like a pretty straightforward way to do things here. Well, there's a problem. Here's the idea, is that the regression coefficients, little b, little d, and any other regression coefficients, in this situation represents people's change or people's responsiveness to past changes in income or past changes in tax rates or past changes in interest rates, changes in wealth, and so on. So the regression coefficients represent people's behavior, and that's really important here. Suppose that when Congress and the President change the tax rates, that people's behavior changes. Well, if their behavior changes, the regression coefficients might change as a result. And if the regression coefficients change, unbeknownst to Congress and the President or to other policymakers, then any predicted changes in consumption are going to be incorrect. And so let's make up some numbers here. Let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that economists had gathered a bunch of data, and again, we're going to ignore other things here, and suppose they found the relationship between consumption and real income and the tax rate to be the little equation I've got there. And so the setup would be that increases in income, other things equal, would affect consumption in a positive manner, and that other things equal, an increase in the tax rate would tend to reduce consumption. And so if we're interested in getting an estimate of how consumption changes, we would simply plug in a new tax rate, multiply it by minus 0.05, and we'd observe the change in consumption, the predicted change in consumption. So again, it seems really straightforward. But here's the problem. Suppose that the tax change is relatively dramatic and that this changes people's behavior with respect to taxes and maybe even with respect to changes in income. So that the new relationship between consumption and income and the tax rate is given by the equation we've got here. And so notice that the regression coefficients have changed. The tax rate coefficient has gone from minus 0.05 to, say, again, with my made-up fake numbers here, to minus 0.2. And here's the difficulty. Policymakers don't know that the model has changed because they haven't had enough time to observe enough data to estimate a new statistical model to allow them to figure out what the new coefficients would be. So in other words, they're operating as if the coefficient on real income was still 0.95 and as if the coefficient on tax rates was still minus 0.05, when in fact they're different. And so it should be pretty clear then that if policymakers are going to make estimates on the impact of consumption based on tax rate change, they're going to be incorrect because they're using an incorrect model. We can also make an argument in terms of monetary policy. So suppose the Fed is thinking of pursuing an expansionary policy. And so they want to think, well, gosh, how does a reduction in, for example, the federal funds rate affect GDP growth? So they would create, just like before with the tax rate example, a statistical model. And let's suppose that this model might look something like this. So they would correlate GDP growth with, say, past changes in the federal funds rate, along with other things, because we know, of course, that many things affect GDP growth. But let's, for, again, the sake of argument, just ignore the other stuff, at least for right now, and just focus in on the past federal funds rate. Well, we might have observed from this past behavior that reductions in the federal funds rate would tend to be correlated with eventual increases in real GDP. But suppose this time around, when the Fed pursues an expansionary policy, what happens if people's expectations change? Particularly, suppose they expect a lot of inflation. Well, this might cause the coefficient, the little b in our example, to become different than it used to be, that was estimated by the Fed and their economists. What might happen here is that the model won't be of any value because it won't correctly predict the change in GDP growth, because the relationship between the federal funds rate and GDP growth has changed, because people's behavior has changed. And their behavior has changed because their expectations have changed. And this is the underlying bottom line of what the Lucas critique is all about, that policy makers face very, very difficult decisions when taking into account people's expectations. When people's expectations change, their behavior changes. When their behavior changes, how they react to tax rates and monetary policy or any other policy variable you can think of changes. And as a result, using statistical models to evaluate policy changes isn't going to work very well. So, in order to make good predictions, policymakers have to take into account people's behavior. And their behavior, of course, is going to be a function of, among many other things, their expectations of future policy actions and the future state of the economy. And not surprisingly, that's really difficult to do. Measuring and modeling people's expectations is relatively difficult. And so that really raises the bar for policymakers in terms of making decisions with respect to both monetary policy and fiscal policy. And of course, if it's really difficult, there's a very high chance that outcomes aren't going to be exactly what policymakers anticipated. Well, what we saw then is that with our two examples, that expectations affected our policy outcomes, both with a fiscal policy example and a monetary policy example. Well, let's look at another example with monetary policy, and let's use the agri-demand, agri-supply model to illustrate how this might work. And so what we want to do here is also bring back the idea of credibility as well, which we've discussed in previous videos. Well, let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that the Fed is facing a relatively high and undesirable inflation rate and that they want to reduce it. And so, not surprisingly, they would tend to pursue a strategy that would reduce the agri-demand curve, shift it to the left, and that, of course, would work to reduce the inflation rate. So that seems very reasonable. Well, what we want to do here is evaluate this change under two different scenarios. We want to first evaluate it when the central bank, the Fed, doesn't have any credibility, meaning people do not take them at their word, that they cannot be trusted to say what they, or to do what they've said, and so that they have an issue with some reliability. And then we want to look at it in terms of the central bank, the Fed, having credibility, meaning they talk the talk and walk the walk. If they say something, people and the public in general expect the Fed to follow through with actual action. And so what we've got here is a situation like this. Suppose the economy is starting at something like 0.1. And if we're starting at 0.1 with our relatively undesirable inflation rate, we're, again, just assuming we're at full employment here. And again, what we want to do is reduce the inflation rate down to say 2%. Well, of course, the Fed would work to reduce the money supply. They'd maybe raise the federal funds rate. That would choke off a little investment and consumption. And that might, for example, shift the agri-demand curve from 81 to 84 as shown in the chart here. Well, lower agri-demand, however, works to put downward pressure on GDP and income. And so in the short run, we might end up at something like 0.2. And so notice that in order to get lower inflation, we've had to pay a price. We've had to pay a price in terms of lower output and also, along with that, higher unemployment. And the reason that we've had to deal with this situation, why we've had to pay this price, is that when the Fed reduced the money supply, suppose we had this situation, that they actually announced they were going to do it. They told everybody we're going to reduce the money supply in order to reduce the inflation rate. But this is where the lack of credibility comes in. What if nobody believed them for some reason? What if nobody believed that they were going to pursue or follow up on that policy, and so that people's inflationary expectations did not change? Because remember, in a previous video, we saw that changes in inflation expectations affect the short-run aggregate supply curve. And if people's inflationary expectations don't change, the short-run supply curve won't shift, or at least right away. So for a while, the economy operates at 0.2. Now, over time, inflationary expectations will adjust, and the economy will reach its maximum sustainable output back at something like 0.4 here, and inflation will, in fact, decline down to a more desirable level of, say, 2%. But in order to get that lower inflation rate, we had to pay a price. But now let's switch things up a little bit and imagine that this central bank has credibility. That when they say, gosh, we're going to reduce the inflation rate by reducing the money supply by pursuing a contractionary policy, is that the public's inflationary expectations adjust accordingly. That people look at the inflation rate, the current inflation rate of 10%, they realize it will fall to, say, the new long-run 2%, and when that happens, the short-run aggregate supply curve will start shifting down from AS1 down to AS4. And that will happen more quickly than under the no credibility situation. Because remember, under the credibility situation, everybody believes what the Fed is going to do. They trust the Fed to follow through on its actions, and as a result, they adjust their inflationary expectations. So the economy, in other words, moves more quickly from 0.1 to 0.4. And as a result, there is less of a loss of output and a lower increase in unemployment than the no credibility situation. Thank you.